Welcome back. In today's episode of our brand new series, we want to talk about a very important topic, and that is anatomy. That reminds me a little bit of studying for my riding badge. It's a lot of learning stuff by heart and it's a bit boring, but for saddlery it is actually very important. And it's a hot topic, to be honest, because with anatomy you can explain why a lot of the guidelines that are officially in place actually can't be right anymore. So let's get right to it. This is Carlo. You recognize him from a previous video. He's a 5-year-old Destano Fürstenball Oldenburg horse, a sport horse, a super modern dressage horse, and he's been living with us for 2.5 years, and we've been also working with him for 2.5 years. And with him I will show you what has changed anatomically. And later I'll get a different horse, Luenzo, because Carlo isn't actually that tall. He stands 64, 65, and Luenzo is almost 1 meter and 80 centimeters tall. And I'd like to show you that height actually doesn't make a difference when it comes to the saddle area. So if you need a bigger saddle area like 17.5 or 18, you won't necessarily be happier if you buy a taller horse. And then I have an older candidate who is over 20 years old now, and he represents an older type that was bred earlier. And with him I can show you what has changed. Carlo is a horse that doesn't move spectacularly much when he's alone in the paddock, but in terms of angles and leverages, riding him is actually very nice. And the main thing that is important when it comes to saddles is that the shoulder has room to move freely. This entire area is the shoulder blade, and you can see the upper part here. If you ever took a closer look at the skeleton, you know that the bone looks a little bit grazed here. And then we have a half moon shape, that is the cartilage. And we have forearm, arm, and the shoulder blade. So this is the direction. And here is the scapula, that is our center of rotation. So the entire area is moving via the center of rotation. So when the foreleg comes forward, this entire area shifts backwards via the center of rotation. So what I'm marking right now is what we need to stay away from. That is taboo for the saddle because the shoulder needs to move freely. We need some space. So if you now think about how to measure a horse, here, there, where do I start? The usual answer that you get is 2 fingers behind the shoulder blade. And honestly, I could not tell you where that is exactly. And I always ask the experts at the saddle clinics. I talk to established master saddlers and talk to veterinarians and ask them if they can show me where 2 fingers behind the shoulder blade is. And I think actually that it is very difficult, and if not impossible. So that means our starting point of where we measure is already in a gray area, and if you ask 3 different people, you will likely get 3 different answers. But what we do know is that this area needs to move. The other part, so the back part of the back, there is still this theory in use about the 18th rib, that this is the end of the saddle area. If you feel your way up along the rib, this is the 18th thoracic vertebra. And some background is, so we have the thoracic spine here, the cervical spine, and the lumbar spine. And this point marks a clear separation of 2 different shapes of vertebrae. So the thoracic spine, the vertebrae here, they look like they have some dragon's fins on top. And the transverse processes actually are very narrow. And in the lumbar spine, the vertebrae have very wide wings and they look a bit like crocodile scales. And this point marks the transition between these 2 shapes. So at some point in time, someone just said the end of the thoracic spine is the end of the saddle area. And this is like saying you need 2 fingers here and a hand width behind the saddle, and between the elbow and the girth you need another hand. And using hands and fingers as measurements is very popular in equestrianism, but scientifically it is not accurate at all. And still it is used, even in court, to judge if a saddle is long enough or not. So that would mean our beautiful Carlo is the same like an Icelandic horse and like a Shire horse and like a Shetland pony and like an English thoroughbred. Exactly the same. So what applies to a Shetland pony applies to Carlo, because the 18th rib is the 18th rib in any horse. And you notice that this is utter nonsense. And I do not make myself very popular saying this, but many of the people I work with and many of my clients are very intelligent, so I wouldn't dare tell them about the 18th rib nonsense, because I always have to assume they do their own research and find out about it. But what I did find out is that in breeding, and we will actually make a video about breeding history and talking about the changes that have occurred, but if you want to have a specific movement in a horse, you'll need bones and muscles and ligaments, tendons to support that movement. So if I want a show jumper, I need to breed a horse that has the physical potential to jump 1 meter 60 centimeters high. I need a composition of physical abilities and of a mindset, so that I have a horse that is able to jump that high but also wants to jump that high. So I obviously have different requirements if I breed for Icelandic competitions or for dressage. So in dressage, if I want to have a really nice trot, then this is another goal that I have for breeding. So in breeding, we always look for an animal that serves a purpose, and Carlo's purpose is to be a dressage horse. But as a breeder, I do not think in detail about any bone that I want to breed. I breed because I want a result, but in order to get the result, we have to think about bones. So in the hindquarters of the horse, I have the pelvis, I have the spine, I have the femur bones, and all these angles and all the ligaments. They make the movement of the hindquarters, and that movement is triggered by the abdominal muscles, and this mobility here shows what is possible. And what is an easy thing to do is this 18th rib, it should be reflected in the saddle somehow, right? And I found that when you're looking for patterns and schemes, and we all do this, and because we need criteria where we can judge stuff, 2 fingers in the halter, or that you put 3 fingers in it to check if the noseband is loose. We all need some guidelines and something to provide orientation in our daily work with horses. So what I found out is that we have something called the golden ratio. So you feel where the top of the hip bone is, and then you go to the root of the tail and you mirror the distance on the other side, and where you end up is where the end of the saddle area is. And this is super individual to each horse. So an Icelandic horse has a very short croup, so you end up here. And for Carlo, this is here. So this area, what I'm marking, is the saddle area. And I think we all know we have a problem, because if I wanted to sit up there, or one of my many clients that does not have seat size 16, we really need to get creative what we can do with our material in order to not restrict the horse. But first we need to prove if my theory works. So there's a reflex point here, and I press it. So please watch the lines, and you can see the point that we're looking for is right here. Not there, here. For some horses it's there. That would be the type that was bred until 1980, so more of a working horse. But for Carlo, it's here. So if I were to put a saddle on Carlo that reaches until the 18th rib, so a saddle that meets the legal standards and covers that little discrepancy. So I put a saddle on there that was patented in the 1980s, and it was made for a horse that lived in the 80s. This would be like you putting on a riding boot, and this riding boot is 1 or 2 centimeters too long. you'll be able to walk with it, but you'll walk like an idiot, and this is what's happening to the horse, because their movement is restricted. When they are 3 or 4 years old, that works okay, because you do a lot of rising trot, you don't sit in the saddle a lot. But if you want this mechanism, if you want the horse to pick up some weight, and we want to teach them to carry themselves actually, then this part needs to rise and this part in the front as well. So the movement that starts from the back means this part needs to rise, and this is the back that we want to have. But this mechanism of rising is blocked right away if I put long wedges on there, or if I put a saddle that is supposed to distribute the weight in a larger area. And this story is super essential if you want to understand saddles. And the shoulders have moved back. That's a trend in breeding. And this means the girth moves back as well. And that means between the elbow and the girth, we no longer can fit one hand, but 1.5. A former employee of mine, Michael, he called this a disharmonic saddle area, and I quite like this term. And this shows us that we are working with completely different points, and we're facing now new challenges with girths, because we have different acupressure and pressure points than with the traditional location. So we're facing many different challenges in saddle making at the moment, because we're moving more in the back, so we need to go to the front. We're moving more in the front, we need to go to the back. I can't go there because of the pressure and the problems the horses get with that. So it's a huge challenge, which is why saddle trees that are traditionally manufactured and place the rider here, these saddle trees are wrong. If you then, like some manufacturers did, because they all noticed the horses are getting shorter, if you then take away the long wedges and cut them shorter, it doesn't do anything to solve the problem, because you're still sitting in the back part of the saddle, and the pressure on this area actually increases because the panel isn't there anymore. So if you have to change something, you have to change the trees, you have to change everything. And during the last 10-15 years, I was thinking a lot about these issues, and thank God we now have products that work a lot better. I have a short exercise for all of you physics lovers. I want to show you something. There will always be people that are able to explain to you that distributing weight in a large area is better for the horse, but we all had physics in school. And you remember that diagram? So this is the gravitational force, and it acts towards the ground. And then we have an arrow for the movement. This is walk, this is trot, and this is gallop. Let's take the trot as an example. We learned about these diagrams that the net force is always diagonal. I think you can all remember that. So if I apply this to my horseback, so I distribute the weight in a large area like Western saddles do, or the long wedges, any of these bad things, where would you have to place your girth? Right there. Because that's not possible, I put it here, and I create an artificial seesaw effect. And this is why these long saddles with the long wedges do not work anymore. Or they only work when the horses are very tense, so which is not a good thing. So they can compensate it with their tense body, but the consequences for the horse's health are actually very severe, and veterinarians, physiotherapists, manual therapists, they all have so many horses that they're working with that had problems because of this, because many saddle manufacturers have not understood this yet, even though it can be proven so easily. You can all remember what you learned in physics in school. So anatomically, in the year 2020, horses look very different from horses in 1980, and this needs to be taken into account. So take a look at your horse at home and look, where are you anatomically? It's worth looking at. We are back with our second horse of the day. We will take a look at 3 horses in total today, 2 modern horses, and then in the end I'll show you an older horse on whose anatomy a lot of saddle making is based. But not on Lorenzo's anatomy. He is a 4-year-old Libertad descendant and he's been with us for 2.5 years. And his height is 1 meter 78 centimeters, but he will definitely get that extra 2 centimeters. We have the forearm, the arm, the shoulder blade, scapula. This is where the movement goes. So this is the area that I need to stay away from. The foreleg goes like this, shoulder moves like that. Let's apply the golden ratio theory. Top of the hip bone, tail root, mirror the distance, and this is where you end up. Well, this is not super exact, but it'll do, definitely. And some veterinarians actually are now working with that golden ratio. I'm very proud of that. But some of you might be working with a saddler that prefers to measure more exactly. And if they find a slight discrepancy to my line here, that's okay, because what's important for me is to know what part of the horse is moving and what part doesn't move, because where the horse moves, it can be restricted, which we do not want, and where it doesn't move, we cannot restrict it. This is more practically oriented, and this is my saddle area, and it's super short for a horse that is this tall. And this is the 18th rib. We feel our way up, and this is the 18th thoracic vertebra. And according to German standards and according to the standards that are enforced by the Society of Master Saddlers in England, a saddle to their standards would end here. According to my theory, and many veterinarians agree, a saddle like that would be too long. Let's watch this point, and we can see that this is the point where the horse moves and not there. And we have the same problem here again. If I put a saddle on this horse that would meet legal criteria, it would be too long already according to my definition. And in my daily work with horses, I see so many horses that have that point and they aren't able to walk at all, and they have problems with the lumbar spine and the lower thoracic spine, and they have to go see a chiropractor. And this is all happening because they have a saddle that fits. So this golden ratio theory works quite well. I'll show you an older horse in a moment so you can see where we're coming from. But a trend in breeding was that the shoulders became less steep so that the foreleg was able to move better. And the croups have become more agile as well in order to provide the necessary mechanics. So the saddle area is attacked from 2 sides because the shoulder is coming back and there's more movement in the croup, so we have to go closer to the front. So this area where we can place the saddle is moving a little bit back, which leads to the wrong girth placement, but in total it's become a lot shorter, even if the horse is 1 meter 80 tall. We are back with our third horse of the day. This is Vinnie. He is Katharina's first S-dressage horse and he's 21 years old, enjoying his well-deserved retirement. His descendants is Wolkentanz Lantan, if you want to know, so old Hanoverian blood. And he represents a type that was bred a lot in the 70s and until the 80s, a straighter foreleg, and the shoulder is also steeper. So in this area you'll end up much closer to the front. In total you'll end up much closer to the front, also if we're talking about the room that the shoulder needs to move. So the entire front part of the horse is closer to the front. So I can already place a saddle in this area here. This is the end of the shoulder, and here I can already put a saddle. And if we are taking a look at the back, this is the top of the hip bone, root of the tail, mirror the distance. This is where I end up. So if I take a look at this, this is a lot longer than what we were looking at before with the other 2 horses. And this type is something we had for a long time, and this type actually didn't change a lot from the 50s till the end of the last century, and only when we had artificial inseminations we were able to make so much progress in breeding. For example, adding jumper blood to dressage horses and stuff like that. So if I find the rib and I feel my way up, and then actually where I land is exactly here. So the origin of this theory about the 18th rib, well, this is an idea I had about this, is that if you were to apply the golden ratio approach to this old type, you would also end up at the 18th thoracic vertebra. Let's just check it. Oh yeah, and you can see this is where the inflection point is. So for Vinnie, 18th rib would be correct. My theory applies as well as the theory of traditional saddlery, and this is the saddle area. And this type of horse can actually wear these long saddles that I have been talking about. But the problem is that on today's market we still have a lot of saddles that have been developed during Vinnie's times and earlier. I always recommend you check the year the tree was patented when you buy a saddle. And you cannot put a saddle like that on horses like Luenzo and Carlo, which is why I'm showing you this. Thank you, Vinnie. And I think you now have a better idea after I showed you the reality in the stables.